So, today on the podcast, we have 4 stories, many of them focused on the California resort. First, Rapunzel's tower comes to California, and also how Rapunzel is edging into some of the character space traditionally occupied by Snow White. Second, a surprise appearance by Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln at the Opera House, and how the staging for this attraction has changed since its closure. Third, how the lessons of Galaxy's Edge appear to have reshaped expansion plans for Avenger's campus. And lastly, Disney announces the next wave of animatronics, figures arranged through machine learning and powered by generative AI, and why there might be a hidden downside to this plan. But before I get to any of that, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so these here are the people who keep this whole enterprise going. I'm grateful for all of our subscribers over on Bandcamp, but a special note of thanks today is going out to new subscribers: Christian J, Aaron TK, Fa Salama, and Suze WDW. Thanks to each of you and to all of our subscribers for supporting what we do here. But now let's move on to the show. We'll start off again with some walk-around news that is related to the parks, and this time we'll begin out in California with the Disneyland Resort. Over in Fantasyland, Storybook Land has reopened with a miniature version of Rapunzel's tower from the movie Tangled. It's been placed along the canal a little more than halfway through the ride just before Toad Hall. This gives both the Magic Kingdom in Florida and Disneyland in California scale model versions of Rapunzel's tower. But neither are arranged in a full themed area, nor are they attractions unto themselves. Neither are even close to being full-sized, though the one in Florida is a whole lot bigger than the one in California. Beyond the simple appearance of yet another film element appearing on the Storybook Land canals, this might also suggest that there are some larger movements elsewhere in the Disney company. Disney rarely includes random film IP that is a decade old into a park unless there's some other way to promote that inclusion, such as with a ride that then will increase ticket sales, or with a lot of new merch, or with some other element of synergy. So here's maybe what's happening. That long-rumored off-again, on-again live-action version of Tangled might be back under active consideration over at the studio. Back in March of this year, Variety reported that the live-action version of this film, with Michael Gracie of The Greatest Showman directing, was put on hold. This happened almost immediately after large financial losses mounted up from the live-action remake of Snow White. There's a lot of plot overlaps between Tangled and Snow White. Tangled is also the story of a princess deprived of her biological mother, who is then placed in a type of domestic confinement, and there's some other things that we'll talk about later. But then after the financial success of the live-action remake of Lilo and Stitch this past June, there were rumors again that a live-action Tangled might be back on its way to possibly being made. There are many differences between the live-action version of Lilo and Stitch and the live-action version of Snow White in terms of script and cohesion. Lilo was a far better live-action film than was Snow White, but also the original animated Lilo film is still watched by kids today. As lovely as I think Snow White is as a film, in terms of the relevancy and relatability of its characters, The 1937 version of Snow White might be moving more toward a property that is historically important rather than one that still has a strong appeal to a contemporary audience. Personally, I would easily put the original 1937 version of Disney's Snow White in the top 5 animated features of all time, particularly in terms of importance to the art form. But also, I recognize that Snow White's personality, which is a mix of, let's say, naivete, dreaminess, gentility, and demure actions, likely connected more with young audiences from the 1930s than her personality does today. And this leads to perhaps why Disney might now be reconsidering Tangled. Rapunzel, whose personality, in contrast to that of Snow White, is a blend of curiosity, bravery, sassiness, and skills of observation, which likely connects better with kids today. The animated versions of Snow White and Rapunzel have a lot of plot and character overlaps, as I've mentioned. Both stories feature a teenage girl in an abusive relationship with a mother figure. Both of the mother figures want youth and beauty at the expense of the young protagonists. And both of the mother figures keep the protagonist isolated from others, either in a castle or in that tower. Snow White sees her stepmother for who she is, and therefore Snow White fears her. Whereas Rapunzel is fooled by Mother Gothel, who has essentially kidnapped her as an infant for her hair's magical powers and raises her as a daughter in isolation and tells her that the world beyond the tower is dangerous. Out of a sense of loyalty and dependence, Rapunzel for years believes Mother Gothel, as Rapunzel hopes for a stronger connection with her, which makes this story, for me at least, a more compelling narrative. Snow White's evil is centered on fairy tale villainy, but Tangled is focused on psychological manipulation based on managed confinement, exploitive dependency, and fears of the unknown. Over time, Rapunzel slowly understands how she's been controlled by Mother Gothel. In short, she moves into a deeper space of awareness and trusts her own impressions. From these realizations, she becomes assertive and also comes to know herself. Snow White, on the other hand, never matures with this level of force in terms of her personality. She finds a type of resilience through adversity. She does start a new life for herself in the forest with the dwarfs, but mostly she sees hope and forgiveness as the paths toward maturity. Snow White's personal focus, for the most part, is on relationships and domestic care, such as taking care of the dwarf's cottage, which also ties this film and its protagonist to the 1930s. And 1937, when this film was released, well, that's nearly 90 years ago now. Whereas Rapunzel wants independence and to understand herself and situation, which are far more modern character touchstones, especially for a female protagonist. I absolutely love Snow White as a film, but also I recognize that some of its story elements, though presented with a sense of artistic wonder on screen, may not have the same power for kids today as more recent films. And this, I think, is a very long way of saying, or perhaps explaining, that there's a new Tangled Tower in Storybook Land at Disneyland, and the new tower suggests that perhaps a live-action remake of Tangled might be quietly moving forward now, though nothing, of course, has been officially announced. The rumor is that Scarlett Johansson is possibly being considered for the role of Mother Gothel, and perhaps beyond this, the tower might also signal that Disney, which surely understands that Snow White and Tangled have a lot of character and plot overlap, might be exploring some of these reasons as to why a remake of Tangled might hit a whole lot better at theaters than the remake of Snow White that failed at the box office earlier this year, but we'll probably need to wait for an official announcement to know more than this. Elsewhere at Disneyland, President Lincoln made a brief, unannounced appearance over at the Opera House about a month ago. Almost surely, Lincoln's impromptu and brief return to that stage was to fill in while the Walt Disney show, which is called A Magical Life, had some technical difficulties. The return of Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln was neither announced nor was it continuous. He was there one day and gone the next. Lincoln was there in late October, then Walt returned. Lincoln was there again in mid-November for at least 2 days, but then Walt came back. The plan for Disneyland eventually is to alternate between a presentation of Walt and then a presentation of Lincoln. Perhaps one at the top of the hour and the other at the half hour. But the plan right now, as that Walt animatronics show is still new, is to have continuous showings of Walt. Even though the two figures are on a turntable, Walt and his stage backdrop on one side, Lincoln and his stage backdrop on the other, and the theater could easily rotate between these shows. What seems to be clear is that Disneyland is using the Lincoln show to fill in if there are issues with the Walt show. But the surprise appearance of Lincoln has revealed how his stage elements have now changed. On the Walt side of the turntable is a chair, desk, a wood-paneled wall, and a window designed to resemble Walt's office at the Burbank studio. On the Lincoln side is a chair, table, a globe, and a wooden floor stand, flags, and a backdrop with Ionic-style columns designed to resemble those in the White House. The short backdrop for Lincoln, in my opinion, does make the finale for Great Moments feel a little more confined as opposed to the previous version, where Lincoln settled into his seat against the grandeur of freestanding Ionic columns and then those crimson curtains behind him opened to a wide screen which presented the Lincoln figure in near silhouette as the screen brightened slightly to reveal the sky at dawn with clouds and sunlight subtly gesturing toward the colors of the American flag. But I'd say that the scaled-down grandeur of the Lincoln set is a reasonable trade-off to put two shows in one theater, a plan that probably went a long way to preserve Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln for many years into the future, while also giving us a vision of Walt. Let's now shift across the Esplanade over to DCA, where work moves forward with the Avengers campus expansion. I think the level of this expansion indicates that Disney still sees a strong future for the MCU. So if you're a Marvel fan, that's pretty good news. That this very expensive expansion is moving forward despite a drop in audience interest in the MCU over these past few years. A good part of that drop is due to general superhero fatigue, which also affected Warner Brothers and DC Comics. And I think we're now starting to get to the other side of that fatigue. But the MCU faces other issues as well. The MCU simply had trouble organizing a large multi-project direction after Endgame. Endgame culminated years of narratives with a single event film. In terms of plotting, this was a pretty spectacular feat. But after Endgame, the MCU has faced issues in terms of how it might find a large audience moving forward. The original plan was to organize another ongoing narrative in multiple films and miniseries around a central villain, Kang the Conqueror. But the build-up to Kang was less organic than it had been with Thanos. Also during Phase 4, which initially was that phase to be focused on Kang, the MCU introduced new and younger Avengers, almost surely with an eye toward possibly creating the MCU's version of the Young Avengers. And in this are all the problems. Kang's identity and motivation were never clearly drawn. By revealing compelling and complex motivation for his actions similar to those of Thanos, Thanos was at least trying to save half of humanity by killing the other half. And then there were a lot of off-screen legal issues around assault and sexual harassment charges against the actor who played Kang, Jonathan Majors, that more or less forced Disney, a company whose name is synonymous with family entertainment, to step away from him, bringing an end to the middling Kang cycle long before the story was even fully established. And beyond these issues, audience reaction to that younger group of superheroes was at best mixed. The best fan reaction was toward Kate Bishop in the series Hawkeye, and at the other end of fan reaction were some characters that fans really didn't rally around in such a way as to suggest that these characters could carry a multi-film and multi-series project, such as Billy Maximoff, aka Wiccan in Agatha All Along, or Cassie Lang, aka Ant-Man's daughter, now with her own super suit just like her dad. With all of this, things are a little messy right now in the MCU, but I do think that Fantastic Four was a good attempt to restart the universe and maybe push the MCU in a slightly different direction. In DCA, structural work has been going on for months now, with steel columns being lifted into place to create new show buildings for Avengers Campus. This expansion area will include an e-ticket attraction called Avengers Infinity Defense, where guests will move through the multiverse and into different MCU locations such as Asgard and Wakanda, and through an alternate world where the Avengers didn't win in Endgame and now find an elevated version of Thanos still in power and dominating worlds that must bend to his will. The other attraction for this expansion is Stark Flight Lab, whose vehicles appear to use a KUKA arm and is almost surely a repurposing of the ride tech that was once proposed for an earlier version of an unbuilt Avengers ride where guests would use something like jetpacks, that is what those KUKA arms were for, to move through a battle on Wakanda. That unused ride tech is now essentially a ride in itself, a demonstration of this flight system in Stark Labs. In previous episodes, we've talked about this in depth, how the unique ride system for that earlier proposed version of a never-built Avengers attraction is now the basis for the ride system here without the other large show elements. And that's what's going to be in Stark Labs. The show building for Infinity Defense, last time I was in the park, was entirely framed out and had metal across its roof. It was not quite as tall as the Avengers building presently inside the campus, and the steel framing of the show building suggested that it would be a two-story show building like the one for Rise of the Resistance. It is, however, a massive structure. There was also some metalwork going on in a second area, an offshoot of that large show building, which is where presumably the flight lab will be located. But this work was not nearly as far along as that of the Infinity Defense show building. Basically, this just signals the obvious. Work on the big building was prioritized, almost surely to give crews more time there, as the install and finishing for Infinity Defense is going to take a lot more time than that of Flight Lab. One more thought here before we move on. Avengers Campus is now firmly focused on the past of the MCU, with Thanos and Tony Stark, two characters who in the main version of the MCU are now dead. This, I'm assuming, is a lesson from Galaxy's Edge, where years ago, Kathleen Kennedy from Lucasfilm rather famously convinced Disney CEO Bob Iger to retheme Galaxy's Edge as it was being developed around the new and then in production third Star Wars trilogy with Rey and Kylo. The original plans for Galaxy's Edge, as we've discussed here before, had been centered on the first trilogy with Tatooine and the Mos Eisley Cantina and so on. Essentially, it was arranged around a very famous and very successful film. But at least according to a Disney World vice president, those plans were changed when Kathleen Kennedy suggested that Disney parks should look to future stories and that the older films, such as Star Wars and New Hope, were mostly popular with those who are 50 years old or older. But as the third trilogy came out and did fairly well, it also became clear that the characters and plot elements from the first trilogy still resonated better with fans. I think I can solidify this with just one question. Which villain do you think fans overall would most like to meet in the parks? Is it Darth Vader or Kylo Ren? And so it seems that many years after Galaxy's Edge opened, it seems that in planning for the expansion of Avengers Campus, Disney has taken that lesson to heart. By not focusing on the future of the MCU here, but instead centering this expansion on the most successful elements of its past. Endgame, which is the conclusion of the Thanos cycle, Disney will tell you is the second highest grossing film of all time. This is technically true, but if you adjust for inflation, it's actually the fifth, which is still an extremely impressive achievement. And what's in that number 4 space just above it? Well, the original Star Wars with Tatooine and the Mos Eisley Cantina and so on. So in that, I think some good design choices were made for the Avengers Campus expansion area. The future is always risky in terms of what will and what won't connect with audiences, and the past is far more of a sure thing. The show building for the Avengers ride that plays out that alternate version of the Thanos cycle story now appears to have its columns, beams, trusses, and other elements of its roof in place. Based on actual progress, a reasonable guess as to when this might open is in 2 to 2.5 years. Basically somewhere around the end of 2027 up through possibly mid-2028. But of course, that's unofficial. It is only a guess. Our final section today is focused on a new walk-around Olaf animatronic that was unveiled in video this past week. It's destined for the World of Frozen in Paris and also for a limited time over at Hong Kong Disneyland. You've probably seen a short video of this figure as it's shown up everywhere on socials. There is certainly a wow factor in seeing the walk-around Olaf animatronic. The design and sculpt are amazing, as are the fluidity of its movements. It looks and moves just like the character in the movie, particularly its stylized gait combined with the movement of its head, arms, and body. It has overlapping movements that are extremely convincing. You can remove its carrot nose and then put it right back on. You can also remove at least one of its stick arms and then put that back on as well. As a side note here, I believe that some of its parts are 3D printed, so if something happens or happens many times, replacement parts can likely be generated quickly. In terms of its voice, at least it sounds like it's being done by Josh Gad, the original voice for Olaf in the movies, but it just as easily could have been done by a professional voice double who is matching Gad's phrasing. Again, the whole presentation is pretty convincing. In terms of a competitive dialogue within the theme park community, this figure here is pretty clearly Disney's response to the animatronic version of Toothless the Dragon that guests can now meet over at Epic Universe. But the Olaf figure, at least in those press videos, unlike the Toothless animatronic at Epic, doesn't appear to be arranged for a static meet-and-greet area, but has the ability to move through sections of the park as a realistic figure the same size as the character in the film. This is the descendant of earlier characters from WDI's Living Character Initiative, though this one here is far more convincing than those that came before it, such as the free-roaming Lucky the Dinosaur or the Muppet Mobile Lab. More recent in-park technology includes the BDX droids that occasionally roam through Galaxy's Edge, and those appear believable in their movements as well. But this Olaf figure goes beyond all that. He's designed to greet, interact, and converse with guests in his own voice. This is the result of an open-source framework built with NVIDIA chips and Google DeepMind, which develops AI systems for complex tasks. With this, Disney has created a new animatronics system they called Newton to give animatronic-based characters a deeper level of believability in the parks. The Newton system should be able to help characters like Olaf to navigate open space, to move over complex surfaces, and to configure a path around moving objects such as people. The system together provides high-performing hardware and software frameworks that, along with AI-trained motion layers, allows computations and generative solutions to be quickly arranged to give the animatronics the visual quality of essentially being alive. And the reliance here on cutting-edge computer systems is not something new in the world of Disney. All the way back in the early 1960s, Walt used the Polaris system to bring his tiki birds to life. Up until then, the Polaris system had been primarily used by the military and by aerospace industries. It got its name from the Polaris missile system, a system that managed long-range ballistics launched by U.S. Navy submarines. Disney adapted the system's ability for a theme park show, somewhat like Disney is now adapting technologies and hardware developed by Google and NVIDIA. But back in the 1960s, the Polaris technology was used by Disney in creating shows, not for fluid guest interactions. This new Olaf animatronic would look great in a stage show. It starts with stage puppetry, but creates a more believable and fluid version of it through mechanics and technology, with movements developed and refined through a type of machine learning. But that's not the only use that Disney now sees for these free-moving animatronics. Beyond the use in a stage show, Disney is suggesting that this animatronic would move through guest areas in the world of Frozen. And that brings up some interesting questions. I've been writing them down for the past few days, and most of these hover around a concept from communication studies called social presence theory that suggests generally that humans are naturally drawn to human interactions over those focused on or mediated by technology. And from that, I now have a set of questions that I've been kicking around since the announcement of the Olaf figure. But let's set up these questions first with a story that happened to my family some years ago. When my kids were in preschool, they wanted a mechanical dog. It walked, it sat, it barked. Never mind that we had an actual dog, a really loving Great Dane. Also, never mind that both kids had Dalmatian dog costumes left over from Halloween that they occasionally played with throughout the year, with one or both of them dressing up and pretending to be a puppy. So that Christmas, among other things, they got this mechanical dog. It wasn't expensive. In my memory, I think it was around $20. They had a good time with it for a day or two. My take? They were fascinated by the technology, but then that mechanical dog found a home for the most part in the closet. But the kids, they still dressed up in their leftover Halloween Dalmatian costumes. One would pretend to be the puppy, the other the puppy owner. One would take the other for a walk or give it treats or ask it to sit, even though clearly the mechanical dog looked far more like a real dog and was also the size of a real small dog. Simply interacting with someone pretending to be a puppy was preferable to them than playing with the mechanical puppy. And this here, I think, may be a window in terms of how to discuss the amazing animatronic of Olaf and perhaps some limitations in how guests might relate to him over time, especially after that initial wow factor of its very impressive movements fades a little. In this, I've been asking if our culture is at a point where most people are willing to engage technology as though technology can be a living entity even in play. Or look at it this way. Disneyland Paris and also for a limited time Disneyland Hong Kong are about to create an interesting test situation as to how people will or won't engage AI-powered animatronics when there is no live person providing its voice or managing its movements in real time. And admittedly, kids who are far, far younger than me who grew up around recent technology might be more willing to interact with this type of AI play than I am. But still I see some limitations here that I'm sensing that we, maybe, as a society, aren't quite ready to move beyond. Or maybe I'm just saying I'm old and resistant to change, who knows. Again, in terms of technology and design, the wow factor is definitely there with Olaf. But beyond this, are there relatability factors in which guests, through a willing suspension of disbelief, will allow themselves to be lowered down into interactive experiences that have the textures of authenticity? Or is this more like Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, largely as a display of impressive technology that guests will want to watch and admire as a show, rather than as something that guests will use as an interactive experience? And so now that list of questions or observations that I've been kicking around since the announcement of the Olaf figure. Performers dressed up in a character suit at Disney, or even performers who operate in real time a complicated puppet, or even performers who operate in real time a complicated puppet or piece of machinery, are much better at sensing when children are nervous or excited. Real performers inside of a suit can offer hugs that feel more authentic and pliable with just the right amount of squeeze for the situation than those offered by an animatronic, even if that animatronic has textured padding or various air or fluid bladders to mimic the feel of a flesh and bone body. Actors in costume suits also have far better social reciprocity. That little give and take of small interactions, responding to various bodily gestures and facial cues in a balanced way. AI isn't quite yet up to that task. And this next idea, at least I think, is important. The overall ideological framework for this experience, that is, how guests mentally process the difference of engaging with a realistic animatronic versus engaging with a person dressed as a character, even if the movements of the animatronic are convincing. Or to put this into a simple question, do you speak the same way while on the phone to a computer-generated set of prompts that uses a recorded human voice as you would to an actual person? It's different, right? You speak to the real person differently than to the recorded human voice. Likewise, guests treat technology overall different than people. even when the technology mimics human speech and movement. People understand other people intuitively, even when they're in a character suit, and mentally configure that engagement as qualitatively different than when they're working or interacting with technology. And though I think most park guests over the age of 6 understand that character meet and greets in Disney parks are a type of play acting in which an adult is acting out the role of, let's say Mickey Mouse, I think most people like believing that the person behind the suit is receiving some joy or happiness from the discussion or interaction as well. That is, what we as guests give to the situation, such as a hug or a handshake or a few nice words, matters somehow to the actual person inside the suit or at the other end of the puppet. I also suspect that many guests like believing that there's a person in real time with agency and a will who is choosing to make this pretend experience a reality for us. And beyond this, even with advanced animatronics who have been deeply trained, there's always a small dose of uncanny valley, where we as guests know we're meant to see something as convincing, but micro movements or small repetitions convince us that it's not actually alive. So in all this, I think in-park animatronics are at an impressive stage in their technological development. They are going to be captivating to watch at least the first few times we see them in the parks. But there's a question beyond all this. If guests understand that the animatronic is mechanical and its actions and speech are organized by sophisticated AI, are those guests going to have the same level of experiential satisfaction in meeting one of those animatronics in a park as they do with people dressed in a character suit or a puppet operated by a live person? That is the Olaf experience going to be something close to the situation with my kids and the mechanical toy dog, something initially fascinating but is soon put aside, because the essence of a human-centered experience, even if it's less visually complex, is somehow more satisfying. And that is the outcome that, at least up until this moment, social presence theory has suggested. For me, that's one of the bigger questions that's in play with the Olaf figure. Does this figure represent the future of at least some interactions at a Disney park? Or does this represent an advancement that's better suited for shows, presentations, and some very short photo ops? And that, I think, is one element that we'll be able to explore more once the World of Frozen opens next March over in Paris. A different outro for today. This week, I'll be at Book Soup in Los Angeles to talk about my book, Making Mary Poppins, on Monday, December 1st at 7 p.m. The following Sunday, also at 7 p.m., I'll be at the Coral Gables location of Books and Books in Miami. And then on Saturday, December 13th at 6 p.m., I'll be at the Disneyana Club of Orlando, which meets at the Museum of Military History on 192. I'll leave web links for all of these events down in the show notes where you can reserve a spot for yourself and your guests. Clicking to reserve a spot is free. There's no charge for any of the events in Los Angeles or Miami. The Disneyana Club of Orlando is asking all attendees to contribute $5, which goes entirely to pay for rental space for the event. But that's simply collected at the door. You can click through and reserve a spot right now for free. In terms of the podcast, later this week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday, I'll bump up one of our seasonal stories to the top of the feed to help all of us get in the mood for the holidays this year. This year, we have a short time frame between Thanksgiving and Christmas. In fact, there's right now just a little over 3 weeks until the big day. So I'm putting out some of our holiday episodes to help get us into that spirit. And then next Sunday, I'll be back here with a new episode. And the plan, at least right now, is to continue working through this month's set of news stories. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.